Last time we were here, we just planned out this farming settlement. The purpose of which is to provide more food for Bara Town. This time not just for consumption but also for sales. And now that I'm happy with the overall layout, let's just start building it, shall we? This is Foundation, and I am Lord Bara. Because the town is so far away from Bara Town, it's across the river, it's also acting as a military outpost. So as visitors approach Bara Town, they'll be met with a guard post, perhaps be questioned a little bit why they're coming to the town. And that was the reasoning behind why the military fort here takes such a central and prominent position in this little outpost settlement. But I've hit build on the church. I'm also going to build the tavern and the manor house. I'll also drop in some of the production buildings that are highlighted. As you can see, I've also added in the tailor and the weaver. Reason being is this is actually pretty close to the sheep farm and I'm overproducing on wool, so it'd be handy to just have some more of that going on. It does mean that I'll have to have some commoners here, but I'm prepared for that, so that's why the tavern has been built. So while that's happening in the background, I'm going to let you in on a little bit of intrigue that's going on in Bara Town. Be warned though, this isn't going to be for the faint-hearted. So if there's anyone listening that doesn't like the sight of blood, I advise you to turn off now. But if you're made of sterner stuff, then buckle in and let me tell you what happened. That morning, there was a virgin frost, the kind that seemed to purify the earth itself. The ground glittered like powdered glass underfoot, and the air was sharp enough to sting the lungs. Overhead, the sky stretched out an unbroken crystal blue, unyielding, like the eyes of Mother Mary gazing down from a church fresco. It was a crisp, perfect day. Bara Town, frozen in a moment. And here we find Wilfroy, sat hunched on a rickety stool outside the manor gatehouse. The weight of his mail shirt heavy against his back. A militiaman's life in Bara wasn't exciting, at least not this time of day. He tapped his boot absently against the frozen dirt and let his thoughts wander. The frost could be gone by mid-morning, he mused, melted into the soft mud of approaching winter. His watch was nearly done, and he was already thinking of a hot breakfast and an hour's rest. But the sound of hurried footsteps interrupts his thoughts. Small feet, he noted, light but rapid, more of a scuffle than a steady tread of an adult. Wilfroy straightened just as the figure burst into view. It was a boy. He recognized him. One of the fisherman's sons. He forgot which. No more than 8. He came racing towards him from the direction of the village. His wool cap askew and his face flushed from both exertion and the cold. His breath puffed in frantic, uneven bursts, and his eyes were wide with some unspoken urgency. Without a word, he motioned wildly, gesturing towards the riverbank, his hand trembling as it clawed in the air. Wilfroy's stomach tightened. He didn't need words to know something was wrong. Rising from his stool with a grunt, he threw his cloak over his shoulder and followed the boy down to the winding path that led to the water's edge. Frost cracked beneath his boot as he quickened his pace, his unease growing with every step. Ah, the river. The river was sluggish in winter. Its surface a patchwork of ripples and thin ice. The reeds that lined the shore stood brittle and brown, their tops swaying gently in the chill breeze. Wilfroy approached, and he spotted the familiar figure of a fisherman hunched near the bank. His boy ran down to him, and Wilfroy followed. When he eventually met Wilfroy's gaze, the man's face was pallid, his lips drawn thin as though he were trying to keep something down. His fishing pole lay discarded on the ground, the line still stretched taut into the water. When he glanced up and saw Wilfroy, there was something hollow in his eyes, something that refused to meet the militiaman's gaze for long. Wilfroy took one step closer, his boots crushing the frosted grass. The air by the river was sharper, colder, as if it carried something more than just the chill of the morning. He looked to where the man's trembling hand pointed, down to the river's edge, where the reeds shivered in a faint breeze. And there, tangled in the vegetation, was something dark and bloated. Wilfroy squinted, his first thought going to the usual misfortunes of winter. Livestock swept downstream, or a sack of spoiled grain discarded by some careless farmer. But as he moved closer, the shapes resolved into a clearer, more horrifying picture. It was a body. A man's body, bloated beyond recognition. Skin swollen from days spent in the water, his arms drifted at awkward angles, the reeds tangled around them, grasping like fingers. A shock of dark hair clung stubbornly to the scalp, and patches of it floated loosely in the current. The fisherman's line was still snagged on one of the arms. The hook had buried itself deep into the soaked fabric of the man's sleeve. And it was then that the stench hit Wilfroy. Faint, far off, but unmistakable. The scent of rotting flesh that the cold air could not mask. It sent Wilfroy's stomach to a churn, as he recoiled slightly and swallowed hard. He looked away and took a moment to breathe through his nose. The fisherman gazed at Wilfroy. His expression said everything. Wilfroy looked back at the body, the rippling water lapping lazily against its bloated form, and the weight of what lay before him began to settle in. The frost seemed to lose its luster. The air grew heavy, and the day grew colder. Wilfroy stood motionless for a moment, the boy lingering in front of him, and the fisherman still clutching his knee as though afraid to stand. Finally, with grim determination, Wilfroy tore his eyes away and began to pull the body from the water. The cart creaked under the weight of its grim cargo, its wooden wheels groaning against the rutted path. Wilfroy pulled it behind himself with both hands, clenched tightly to keep out the cold. The boy and the father had stayed behind, unwilling to leave the riverbank, which left Wilfroy alone to guide the cart through the village and up the winding road to the keep. The frosty air bit at his face as he trudged along, his shallow breaths trying to avoid the faint stench of the body. Though he tried to cover it with a tarp, the sight of a boot sticking out from beneath the canvas seemed to draw curious glances from the few villagers brave enough to venture out so early. It's not uncommon, a body and a cart, but still, it was courtesy to cross yourself and murmur as you walk away. The keep loomed ahead, its stone walls grey and unyielding against the morning light. Wilfroy passed through the gates, the guards barely sparing him a glance as he pushed the cart into the yard. He stopped just near the barracks and leaned against the cart for a moment, letting the ache in his shoulders ease. The body felt heavier now that it had been drawn out of the river. As expected, Captain Coleman was waiting outside the entrance to the hall. He was standing still as a statue. A broad man, his presence filling the space like a boulder dropped into a narrow stream. Wilfroy had always thought that he looked older than his years, the kind of man who had seen too much too soon. His face was weathered, lined as though he'd spent decades braving storms, and his shoulders had a permanent slant, as if the burdens he carried were as physical as they were invisible. But what struck Wilfroy the most was his cloak. Heavy, dark grey and fringed with black sheep's wool at the neckline. This new cloak, it had an air of authority and wealth that few in Bara could rival. Also, it must have been very warm, given its thickness. And it wasn't just practical, for every so often, when Coleman moved in just the right way, the lining on the inside caught the light and revealed a flash of green tartan. Quite an extravagant detail that hinted at roots far beyond this small village, Wilfroy thought. "Sir," Wilfroy said, stepping forward and touching his forehead in a salute, "there's something you need to see." Coleman's gaze flicked, first to Wilfroy, and then to the cart, his expression unchanging. For a moment Wilfroy thought that he may brush it off entirely, but then Coleman moved. He stepped to the cart, his boots crushing the frozen ground, and lifted the edge of the tarp with his massive hand. The body beneath was no less grotesque in the stillness of the yard than it had been by the river. Coleman's face remained unreadable as he studied it, though his eyes narrowed every so slightly, as if calculating something unseen. The other hand rested on the hilt of his sword, his fingers drumming lightly against the leather grip. "You found this?" "Yes, sir." "Where?" "Pulled it out of the reeds by the river with a fisherman and his son." There was a long pause. "Good work, Wilfroy," Coleman said at last. His voice was calm, measured, neither praise nor dismissal, but something in between. It was the kind of voice that made you want to straighten your back and hold your tongue all at once. Wilfroy nodded, waiting for more. Coleman let the tarp fall back into place and turned to face him fully, his hands now clasped behind his back. "Who do you think it is, sir?" asked Wilfroy. "Keep your mouth shut on the matter," Coleman said evenly. His eyes met Wilfroy's, and though his tone was calm and even, there was a weight in those words that left no room for questions. "Do you understand?" Wilfroy nodded again, this time more slowly. "Yes, sir." "Good. Leave the cart with me. You go get fed." Coleman glanced at the cart one last time before turning away, the hem of his cloak brushing the frosted ground. That flash of green tartan caught the light again, and then he was gone, his massive frame disappearing through the doorway into the hall. Wilfroy stood there for a moment longer, the chill seeping into his fingers and toes as he watched the doorway where his captain had disappeared. A week had passed since the discovery at the riverbank. The fields around Bara now lay reaped and bare, their harvest bundled into storage against the creeping winter. Frost still dusted the ground each morning, though it burned away faster now, leaving behind the dull, damp chill that seemed to cling to the village like a second skin. Wilfroy shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Standing near the wall of the Hospitium's main hall, his spear rested lightly against his shoulder, his mail shirt pulling at his collarbone in its usual uncomfortable way. This was one of the better posts, he thought. The large, open fireplace at the centre of the room blazed with a welcome heat, sending flickering light across the stone walls and warming the marrow of his bones. The air smelled of wood smoke and the faint, sweet tang of mulled cider. The hall itself was filled with murmurs of conversation, most of it coming from the far end where the tax collector Ashmond sat at a long table. His presence dominated the space even more than the fire. Dressed in attire far too extravagant for Bara, Ashmond cut a striking figure. His doublet was a deep, rich red, lined with a silver thread that gleamed when the firelight caught it, and a jewelled ring glinted on his left hand as he gestured. Across from him sat 3 monks from Middle, their brown habits contrasting starkly with Ashmond's finery. Despite their modest attire, their bearing suggested authority, and their conversation with Ashmond was far from holy matters. The fire at the new church had been a devastating loss, yet the monastery in Middle had continued to invest heavily in Bara. Their voices, low and deliberate, carried snippets of trade agreements and mutual benefit. Wilfroy only half listened. His duties were simple: stand watch, keep out troublemakers, and avoid looking too interested in the dealings of men far above your station. He focused instead on the crackle of the fire, the warmth spreading through his chilled limbs, and the rhythmic hum of voices, so far removed from the biting cold and the grim discoveries of the previous week. It wasn't until one of the monks leaned forward, his hood shadowing his face, that Wilfroy's attention snapped back to the table. Still, the fire was concerning, the monk said, his voice smooth but probing. Has anything else unusual happened since then? Anything that might suggest unrest in the area? Ashmond hesitated, his usual polished demeanour momentarily disrupted. His fingers polished the edge of the table, the jewelled ring tapping lightly on the wood before he could respond. However, Wilfroy, lulled by the ease of the room and the warmth of the fire perhaps, spoke without thinking. "A body!" he blurted. The words hung in the air like frost, sharp and brittle. Ashmond's head turned sharply, his gaze pinning Wilfroy like a hawk sighting a mouse. The monks exchanged glances, their interests clearly piqued. But Wilfroy felt the blood in his face drain. He could almost hear Captain Coleman's voice in his head. "Keep your mouth shut on the matter." "A body?" one of the monks repeated, his tone curious but measured. Wilfroy swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. The warmth of the fire, once so comforting, now felt suffocating, and his mail shirt seemed to weigh twice as much as before. He opened his mouth to respond, but Ashmond cut him off. "Ah, an unfortunate accident," the tax collector said smoothly, leaning back in his chair as though the matter was of no concern. "Yes, a body in the river. The river can be a treacherous place this time of year. No doubt the poor soul fell victim to its currents." His tone was final, leaving no room for further inquiry. The monks exchanged another glance, but said nothing more on the subject. Wilfroy lowered his gaze, his cheeks burning with shame. He shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of Ashmond's gaze on him for a moment longer before the conversation turned back to trade. For the rest of his watch, Wilfroy stood in silence, the warmth of the fire doing little to thaw the chill that had settled in his chest. A summons came at midday, the kind of brisk winter noon where the sun glared high but gave no warmth. Wilfroy made his way up the sloping road to the manor, his boots crunching over gravel still rimmed with frost. His breath fogged the air, though he hardly noticed, his mind a muddle of thoughts about why the tax collector wanted to see him. As he reached the manor gates, I happened to be there. Just leaving, for my own business, you understand. I recall the young militiaman nearly stumbling into me, as a matter of fact, the ginger hair catching the weak sunlight like a copper flare. He looked startled, though not at the sight of me, more like he was running too quickly from his own nerves. "What's your business here?" I asked, more out of habit than genuine curiosity, really. He stammered something about being summoned, his words fumbling together like mismatched boots. I didn't press him. He seemed nervous. He seemed a good sort, though. Honest, if a bit timid. The kind who'd do well enough if the world didn't weigh too heavy on his shoulders. With a nod, I stepped aside and let him pass. The heavy oak doors of the manor loomed before him, and Wilfroy hesitated just for a moment before pushing them open. Inside, the air was warm, almost stifling compared to the chill outside. The stone walls were lined with tapestries, and the faint scent of wax and leather filled the corridors. A servant directed him to Ashman's chambers, and he followed the instructions with a growing sense of unease. Now, the tax collector's quarters were quite charming, almost ostentatious. There was a desk, polished to a mirror sheen, which stood near the centre of the room. It was flanked by shelves of ledgers and scrolls, and a fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Ashman stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp profile silhouetted against the pale light streaming in. Near him, huddled in a chair too large for her frame, was a child, a girl, no older than 10, her legs dangling over the edge and her face half hidden behind a curtain of dark hair. "Wilfroy?" Ashman said, without turning, his voice as smooth and deliberate as ever. "Close the door behind you." Wilfroy obeyed, the door's latch clicking into place with a familiarity that made his stomach tighten. "This," Ashman continued, gesturing to the girl, "is Lyra. She's from Newchurch." Wilfroy scratched his head as he looked at the young girl. "She has been in my care," Ashman said, his tone carefully neutral. "Her safety is paramount, as she may have seen something of interest on the night of the fire." Wilfroy glanced at the girl who was staring down at her lap, her hands clutching the hem of her tunic. She looked thin, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes, dark and sharp, betrayed a watchfulness that was almost unnerving. "Lyra," Ashman said gently, crouching beside her chair, "tell the soldier what you told me about the man you saw that night." The girl hesitated, her small fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress. After a moment, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I saw someone by the church before the fire, a man." Wilfroy felt a chill crawl up his spine, unrelated to the cold outside this time. "What did he look like?" Ashman prompted, his tone encouraging but firm. Lyra's brow furrowed in concentration. "He was tall, big, like a bear." She gestured vaguely, her small hands miming broad shoulders. "And his cloak was grey, dark grey, with fur on the top." Wilfroy caught his breath, his mind racing back down the road to the keep, to the body in the cart, and the towering figure of Captain Coleman. The words she spoke painted an unmistakable picture. "Anything else?" Ashman asked, his gaze flicking briefly to Wilfroy before returning to the girl. She nodded slowly. "There was green on the cloak, inside, when he moved." Wilfroy gripped his spear. He could almost see it, the heavy cloak, the flash of green tartan. His mouth went dry as he stared at the girl, who was now fidgeting under the weight of the room's silence. Ashman straightened, his eyes locking onto Wilfroy. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The unspoken understanding between them was as heavy as the stone walls surrounding them. "You may go," Ashman said finally, dismissing Lyra, with a nod towards the servant standing by the door. The girl slipped from the chair and followed the servant out, leaving Wilfroy alone with the tax collector. Ashman turned back to the window, his gaze fixed on the village below. His voice was calm but deliberate as he spoke again. "I trust you understand the gravity of this information, Wilfroy." Wilfroy shifted on his feet. His chest was tight. But finally he spoke. "Sir, why are you telling me this?" Ashmond didn't turn to look at him. Instead, he clasped his hand behind his back, his fingers tapping lightly against his knuckles in thought. "Because, soldier," he said, his tone heavy with meaning, "sometimes the right pair of eyes is more valuable than 100 swords." On this occasion, the walk from the manor to the keep felt endless. Though the path was familiar and Wilfroy had walked it countless times, today the steps felt heavy, as his thoughts were weighing him down like wet wool. The morning frost had burned away, leaving the ground muddy and slick beneath his boots. His mind replayed the events of the last week with the relentless focus of the millstone. The fisherman's face when he found the body in the reeds, Coleman's calm and pointed order to keep quiet, the monks from Middle, their veiled questions about unusual happenings, and finally, the girl, Lyra, and her description of the man that you'd seen. Tall, big, grey cloak, green tartan. It rang in his ears. Wilfroy clenched his fists, his breath coming in sharp bursts that misted in the cool air. It all pointed to one man, Captain Coleman, his captain. Eventually, he reached the base of the hill where the keep stood, the stone walls towering above the village like a sentinel. The gate was just ahead, but his feet faltered. The realization that, well, it was too enormous, too damning. Coleman wasn't just a leader to him. He was a man who'd taken him under his wing, who'd praised him and hadn't laughed at his clumsiness. He felt he'd been surprisingly warm to him, in fact. Could he really be the one responsible for the fire at New Church? For the murder of that man? The man who turned out to be a coal merchant from Northbury. His hands felt cold and clammy. As he came to a stop a few paces from the gate, staring up at the dark wooden doors reinforced with iron bars, he looked through the archway into the cobbled courtyard, and for the first time in his short service, he hesitated to enter. "You look like you've seen a ghost, lad!" The voice startled him, and he turned sharply to see Ozymandias, the blacksmith. He was striding up the path towards him, tall, broad, muscular in frame, and bulked up further by the heavy leather apron slung over his shoulder. His breath plumed and his eyes gleamed with intent. Wilfroy tried to compose himself, forcing a weak smile. "Ozzy, didn't expect to see you here." "I've business with my cousin," Ozymandias said, jerking his thumb towards the keep. "Thought I'd catch him before he gets too busy barking orders at you lot." Wilfroy's eyebrows shot up. "Cousin?" He suddenly saw it. The resemblance to Coleman was quite striking. Broad shoulders, angled jaw, and a gaze that seemed to cut through to the bone. Ozymandias' dark hair was tied back neatly, and his face was marked with soot, a testament to his work at the forge, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Now that you point it out. "So, what brings you to the keep?" Wilfroy asked, his voice unsteady but polite. Ozymandias paused, wiping snot from his nose. "I'm here to see Coleman," he said, shifting the leather satchel on his shoulder. "I need to borrow his cloak. Since that coal merchant stopped coming, I've been handling the deliveries. It's a pain, but worth it for the cut. But the weather's turned, and I won't last long out there without an extra layer." Wilfroy frowned. "The coal merchant?" Not for months, Ozymandias replied flatly. Last time I saw him it was early spring, just before the thaw. Haven't heard a word since, and someone's got to fetch the coal. So I've been making the trips. You don't pay attention, do you, lad? Wilfroy shook his head. What happened to him? The coal merchant. Ozymandias just grunted, apparently unconcerned. We won't be seeing him again. As Ozymandias turned and strode towards the gate, his words settled in Wilfrod's mind. The coal merchant hasn't been here since early spring. That was the new church fire. And if Ozymandias was making the runs by himself, then he must have been the last person to see the merchant alive. The thought suddenly struck Wilfroy like a cold wind. He glanced over his shoulder at Ozymandias' retreating figure. His strides purposeful, his satchel swaying at his side. If not for the ensemble, he could have been mistaken for Coleman, especially if he was wearing his cloak. The blacksmith disappeared into the keep, and the courtyard fell silent. He turned his gaze back to the gate, its dark timbers looming before him. Whatever answers lay ahead, they wouldn't come easily. Steeling himself, he stepped into the archway and let the shadows swallow him whole. Well, that's all I've got time for. I've got some errands to run, so I'll just say, if you have been, thank you for watching, thank you for listening. This has been Foundation, and I have been Lord Bara.